Hello! Today we're talking about the beginning of Chapter 4, Lesson 4-1, Classifying Triangles. We can classify a triangle in two different ways, by their angles or by their sides. Now, all of your triangles are going to have at least two acute angles, but the third angle is the one that we use to classify the triangle. We can have an acute triangle where you have three acute angles, a right triangle with one right angle, an obtuse triangle, one obtuse angle, or an equal angular triangle. That's a triangle that has three congruent angles. Each of the classifications is a distinct group. Now you might be thinking, well, if they're all acute, if they're all equal angular, maybe they're all three acute. But you want to give it the best name. And if it's a triangle that has three congruent angles in it, even if those three congruent angles happen to be acute, we still want to call it an equal angular. Take a look at example 1. Classify each triangle as acute, equal angular, obtuse, or right. Again, we want to look at our angles. So we have the two acute angles. Here's the third angle. That third angle is obtuse. Therefore, we have an obtuse triangle. Example 2. Again, we're looking at our three angles. All three of the angles in this triangle is acute. So we have an acute triangle. Again, look at the three angles. Here's our two acute angles. Here's the third one. It's a 90 degree. It's a right angle. Thus, that makes this a right triangle. And in example 4, notice that we have three acute angles in there, but all three of those acute angles are the same. Therefore, we would make this equal angular. Yes, all three of the angles are acute, but since all three of the angles are also equal, equal angular is the best name to use. We can also classify triangles by the number of congruent sides that they have. A scalene triangle has no congruent sides. An isosceles triangle, two congruent sides, at least two congruent sides. An equilateral triangle has three congruent sides. An equilateral triangle is a special kind of isosceles triangle. The definition for isosceles is at least two congruent sides. An equilateral has at least two, but since that third side is also congruent, it's equilateral, but it's a special isosceles. Example 2, very similar to example 1, we're now going to classify the triangle by the sides that it has. So we look at the three sides. It has three congruent sides. Our first example is an equilateral triangle. Our second example. Again, we look at the three sides this time. None of the sides, it has no congruent sides. That makes it scalene. Example 2C, if you will. Again, we look, no congruent sides. Again, this is a scalene triangle. Let me get myself out of the way here. In our fourth example, notice that we have two congruent sides. This is an isosceles. So again, scalene, no congruent sides like these two examples. Equilateral, all three congruent sides. But notice what else you see about an equilateral? It's also equal angular. And we'll talk about that coming up. Isosceles, two congruent sides. The other objective of today's lesson is you also have to be able to find missing values. Take a look at this. Now what we're going to discover is that in a triangle, if it has two congruent angles, it also has the sides being congruent. So that means if these two angles are congruent, which is what the red angle marks mean, that means that the sides opposite them are also congruent. So 31 would equal x minus 6. Add 6 to both sides, and we discover that x equals 37. Again, this angle and this angle are congruent. That means that 5x minus 153 equals 47. The sides opposite those congruent angles are also congruent or equal. Add 153 to both sides. 5x equals 200. Divide both sides by 5 and you find out that x equals 40. Here, notice that all three of the angles are equal. That makes this an equiangular, also an equilateral triangle. Therefore, 6x minus 100 equals 50. Add the 100 to both sides. 6x equals 150. And thus, x equals 25. And that is lesson 4-1.